Welcome to yet another launch event, this time on 2023 Release Wave 1. Thank you for joining our session. My name is Peter, and I will be your host today, together with my colleagues Esben and Steffen. Today we have a packed agenda. We will show you the new AL Explorer and AL Home, some improvements to the code analyzer performance, a lot of productivity improvements and AL improvements. We're going to show you how you can now attach the debugger. I'll talk a little bit about app source transactability, as well as improvements to the app source processes. And at the end, I'll also share a couple of messages with you. First up, let's have a look at the exciting new AL Explorer and its friend AL Home. Esben, please show us what this is all about.
Thank you, Peter. It's now more than 5 years ago since we launched the AL language extension for Visual Studio Code. It was a fundamental shift from the old Seaside model, but a necessary shift for us to move to the cloud with our product. In the cloud, we had to support extensibility and modularization, which we couldn't achieve with Seaside. We wanted to integrate the new tools with a more professional world. We want to make it easier to ramp up new developers, and we want to facilitate the use of CI/CD pipelines. In general, being more professional with Business Central development. From the beginning, there was a lot of excitement, but also some worries about the changes. We had a lot of consultants that felt that they lost something. And that's true. We got a lot of new stuff, and it was a big improvement, but we lost something. Seaside was easier for consultants. It has some features that made it easy to navigate, it made it easy to discover objects. With the introduction of the new AL Explorer, we are bringing some of those losses back into our product. It's a powerful tool, not just for consultants, but also for pro developers. It makes it easier to navigate around the source. It makes it easier to explore, to engage with objects, run them, subscribe to them, but also discover extensibility points. The base app that we deliver is a huge code base, and it's hard to figure out where can I extend, where can I integrate. And AL Explorer is the first step for us in a tool set that will help you do this in a more efficient way. So let's take a look. I have here Visual Studio Code, and in here I have opened our base app just to show that this is not just a toy tool we are developing here. It's all the base app. I loaded it up front, but it's running on a small Surface Pro 6, which is more than 3 years old. So it's not a powerful piece of hardware. But let's fire up the new AL Explorer, which benefits from the fact that the compiler is running in the background. We have a language server who already knows all of this. So we just need some visualization on top to help us display this. The new AL Explorer consists of a big list, which is similar to the old object list in Seaside, but it can do a little bit more. On the upper right corner here, we have the active project. It resembles the already existing selected project in Visual Studio Code. It's just highlighted here in the top. And just here above the list, we have a number of filtering capabilities. Starting from the right, we have the modules. I have a bunch of selections here. I have bookmarked. I can bookmark objects that I want to see. If it's like a working set, let me bookmark this. And I can pick here. And then I have the small subset of objects I'm working with at the moment. I can also select from the different modules or projects which are in my graph. And the graph of objects or modules are viewed through the lens of the active object. What you can see is the active object and all the dependencies, But you can also zoom in on, in this case, I only want to look at the system app for this right now. But let's go back to the all here and take a look at the next one. Group by is a way of, for instance, grouping by type. Now you get something that resembles the object list. I have, for instance, more than 1800 code units, a number of controller links, .NET declarations, and so forth. And I can expand these and work with the objects in there. We also have things like related table, for instance, is a way of grouping by related table, which is on the code unit, the source, the table number, and on the page, the source table. And also in this release, we have actually grouped the base application with a path, which give you a slightly different view where things are grouped by the path. And you can see here, in this case, this is from the system application. This is the Azure AD graph objects from the folder there. It gives you a grouping by area, which is nice if you want to, for instance, work with, let's say, bank management. You can see these are all the objects that relates to bank management. On the left, you have search. And of course, you can type and search. If I could spell, say customer, I get all the objects with customers in. But I can also do something like, for us who has been here for a while, we know that, for instance, 21, it's in, if we're talking about pages, it's the customer card, or for a table, it's the customer ledger entry. So it makes it easy if you happens to know the idea of what you're looking for. What we have also added here are some buttons down here below that allows you to engage. You can, of course, move to the source, but you can also run the objects if it's a runnable object type. And that saves you a trip into the launch.json and change the object. You can just run it directly from here. In this case, I'm running the query. It's a boring query, but I can also run a customer card. This makes it easy for me to navigate to something I'm working with and run it, test it. Up here at the top, we have something which makes it different from Seaside. What we have tried to focus on here is extension points, places where you can extend the base app. Let's take a look at the events. These are the events which I can subscribe to from all the modules that I have in my graph right now. And as you can see here, I have actually grouped those by path, which makes it interesting because in this case, if I want to subscribe to something related to the Azure AD plan subsystem, I here have all the events from within there, and I can click the subscribe and it will paste a subscription into the clipboard that I can paste into my code. The next one here is APIs. These are the APIs that you can work with if you want to access your Business Central from an external source. It gives you an overview and it makes it easy to see what we have right here. And the last one, that's definitely my favorite. These are extensible enums with an implemented interface or more. These are places where there is a structured extension point, which is way more than just an event. These are those that you want to look for a structured way to extend an area. And of course, you can also move around folders, you can resize them, and even better, what you worked with the last time is saved in your workspace. So you will get your search back and your bookmarks and all that for the same workspace the next time you open it. It's a nice feature. The other thing we have made, which is built on the same technology, is the AL Home. And the AL Home is the place where we will deliver news for developers. News for R&D, it can be links to blogs, it can be things that should be aware of, upcoming changes to the project, things which are targeting developers. And we plan to deliver periodically and frequently interesting news here. Yes, back to you, Peter.
Thanks for the demos, Esben. So the AL Explorer really looks nice and helps being more productive in discovering, navigating, and extending objects, especially in larger solutions. So let's talk about the improvements that we've done to the code analyzers. So the code analyzer framework is a major component of the perceived performance during code authoring. So apart from large apps with many objects, which you can improve performance with by splitting them up or using the rapid application deployment, then every change will basically trigger a recalculation of the code analysis diagnostics. And that's why the performance of the code analysis can actually have quite a big impact on especially larger solutions. Now, in this release, we have optimized when the rules are run. We have fixed some efficiencies, and not least, we have actually disabled rules, made sure that disabled rules no longer run, because actually they could do before and just having their output not shown. So that's all performance improvements that we've done under the hood. But we also introduced a new file scope for code analysis during authoring. This is actually now the default. So code analysis rules now only run on the active file by default. That gives a much better performance during coding with this file scope only. And since most of the rules rely on local analysis anyway, and that's what you're interested in typically when you're authoring, that's not really a big trade-off to do. Because the benefits are that the workspace size no longer prevent using code analyzers, that they can be then enabled for larger apps and be used for everyday work. And you don't have to wait to get the results. I mean, sometimes today they would be turned off and not used during authoring because of the performance impact. And then partners would rely on CI/CD pipeline builds for instance, getting code cop errors. But with this improved performance, you can actually have them still enabled and get them surfaced during code authoring directly. Of course, when you're doing a full build, the enable rules will still all run in that scenario. So you can actually control this behavior through the background code analysis setting. Now, it might be a little bit strange, but we do a little bit of managing ourselves depending on the workspace size. I said that we always run on a file scope now by default, but that's not entirely true. If the workspace is small, and by small currently that means less than 100 files, we actually still run analyzers for all the files. Unless, of course, you turn off background code analysis completely, right? For larger workspaces with more than 100 files, which likely will be most of the extensions out there, then what happens really depends on this background code analysis setting and the scope that the setting is defined in. On each project in the workspace, you can set how this background code analysis should run. You can choose that it's only run on the active file, and as I said before, that's the default. When that is set, whenever you edit a file in the project and the workspace is more than 100 files, it will actually only run the code analyzer rules for that active file. You can still in the project say that you want to run on a project scope, on a project level. And that means that whenever you change something in the project, it will run code for all of the objects in the project itself. And then you can turn it off so it's not running at all. Now, you can actually also put these settings on a workspace scope. So if you include it in the workspace settings, this same behavior, you can apply that to all projects in the workspace. So maybe in the workspace level, you said that you want to use file behavior or you want to use project behavior, and then that will apply unless the specific project overrides it by its project settings. And the same for a user scope setting. Again, you can decide the behavior you want to use as a user across every workspace, and then that's again only going to differ if it's overwritten by the workspace or by the projects in that specific workspace. Now, these are the settings for the projects themselves. Typically, you will be working with projects that have dependencies on other projects. And what happens there basically depends on the target project, right? So the target project in the graph, in the dependency graph, will decide. So if I'm currently working in a project where it's set to file level, and I'm editing one file, and it's only the active file that will have code analysis running, if there's any downstream impact, it will actually look on those projects. And if those projects are set to have code analysis run on the whole project, it will still happen on the whole project, right? So that scope is defined per project. Okay, so not only have we improved the performance in general, as well as introduced the file scope so that it runs in a much smaller on a much smaller set of objects, but we're also giving you as developers the insight into the performance. So we have a new output analyzer statistics setting where you can enable having in the Visual Studio Code output basically a verbose insight into what rules are run and what is the performance or the time spent for each of these rules, right? And that information you can use to decide whether maybe you're running some rules that you don't really care about in this project and turn them off, especially if they are performance intensive. But you can also just validate that you are running all the rules that you are interested in and that they perform well, right? And if any of the rules perform really badly, you can consider then disabling them during authoring and then still have them as part of a full compile or a CI/CD pipeline. So another change we did to the Code Analyzer framework is that you can now take advantage of the new support for having URLs in these rule sets, right? So that makes it a lot easier to share and to maintain and enforce common rules, right? And you have two different options that you can use. You can either use the AL.RuleSet path in the settings. So there you can specify the path to rules. And there's a property at the AL.enable external rule sets that will control whether you are actually using external rule sets or not. So you can lock that down without changing the rule set path itself. The other option that you have is that you can include the URL directly in the rule set file, right? So in the section around included rule sets, you can now also specify a path for pulling in external rule sets. And you can even use these from the compiler in the command prompt because there's a new argument for enabling external rule sets as well in that. So this should make it, again, super easy to share and reuse rule sets. Now we, of course, like every release, have added a number of new analyzer rules. I will not go through these in detail, but just to summarize a little bit, on AppSource we added some new rules to govern the breaking change impact of protected variables and changing or removing those. We also have a new warning around changing from a normal to a temporary table type. We have a bunch of warnings around changing or to use permission set extensions to existing permission sets. I'll talk more about those in a moment. And we also I think Stefan will talk about it briefly, but there's also a different session on this. But we also have now the business events, and we need to make sure that these are also being caught from a breaking change perspective if you change anything in those. Then for PTEs, we have the same rules around permission set extensions. Again, I'll talk about those. And also, we would really like PTEs to use the application property going forward instead of using a direct reference to the base application. We have a couple of UI COP rules around scope repeater actions. and also about the about text and about title properties going forward. And then we have, again, on CodeCop, we have introduced the option for you to gate whether Pragma warning disable should explicitly list the rules that are being disabled. We see, at least internally, sometimes that's forgotten and then everything disabled, and that's found out later. So we now have the option of enforcing that when you disable with the Pragma, that you have to specify explicitly these IDs. And then again, in CodeCop, just like for AppSource and for per tenant, we have the permission set extension rules. So let's talk about those. So basically, when you create a permission set extension, you can include permissions in that extension for an object or for a permission set that is defined in another application that you reference to. Right? So you can basically pull in or grant additional permission. You can also use a wildcard permission that basically grants global access. And we're now detecting that with these new rules. And the reason why we do that is because it's really bad practice. It can incur security risk because you're granting excessive privileges to the users. So users with an existing permission set or with existing permissions can get a lot more permissions for a current app that they installed by installing this new app that extends it, right? That new app that gets installed could grant that user more permissions than what was the intent originally when the user was assigned that permission. Also, the wildcard permissions, as I said, they can pose a security risk because they unintentionally grant excessive privileges to users. Now, we are at this point not enforcing this on PTEs or AppSource apps, but it might be something that we remove support for in the future, that you can, in permission set extensions, include objects that are not in your extension, your own extension yourself. Just like in the last release, also in this release, we have a lot of different productivity improvements for you developers. So the first one is around events and navigability. So since we introduced event publishers and subscribers, it's always been difficult for developers to identify where these event publishers have been used in order to maybe make further adjustments or extensions if necessary, right? And so the reason for that has been that the event subscriber arguments have been using string literals, right? So basically, the parameter in the event subscriber has been setting the event publisher name with a single quote. That meant there wasn't any navigability because we haven't really passed this up as a token that we can understand. But now, event subscribers can use the identifier syntax for these event publisher parameter. And that means either if the event publisher is just a single name without spaces, you don't have to do anything, you just specify the name. If the event publisher has spaces in its name, you have to use double quotes to denote that, right? But having this unlocks powerful Visual Studio Code navigation features out of the box, right? So the first scenario is that on the event subscriber, you can now navigate to the event publisher. So when you hover over the event publisher, you get a tooltip with a name here and see the definition of that. You can also use the go to definition context menu or the F12 shortcut to jump to that event publisher. And you can use the reference tool that we will see in a moment to see all of the uses for that event publisher. Now, on the same time, from the event publisher itself, you can now in CodeLens see all of the incoming event subscribers for a given event publisher, right? In this case, we have one reference into this event. And if I call the references on the event, I can actually navigate and see, jump between the event publisher and all my event subscribers, right? And this would be the same view you would see if you invoked it on the event subscriber. There you would just start in the event subscriber instead of in the event publisher. So this really makes it a lot easier than before to jump between the event publishers and the subscribers for that, or from the event subscriber and understanding what other places in your source is subscribing to a given event. Yeah, here's an animation that just shows how that works. So you are on the event publisher, and you can then invoke the references, and you will see all of the different references, and you can then select those, and the lens will show here the context of where that's used. So, of course, most of you have code that will be using the old string literal way of accessing or specifying the event publisher. And so, since the syntax have changed, we need to convert this, right? And so we have created a code action for you that you can run either on a specific event subscriber, on the whole active file, the whole active project, or on the whole workspace, which is going to substitute these. Basically, it's going to add double quotes, or if there's no spaces, it won't add anything, so that you can convert this and reap the benefit of navigability fairly easily. So I hope you enjoy that. Then when you are working with enums and need to create new values for the enums, we haven't had support in IntelliSense to support the next available ID. We do now. So it's going to both support it in enums and enum extensions, and it's going to be using the current object range, right? So if I'm extending this, it would use my extension range instead to suggest the next available ID. Then, as a developer, when you have been working with temporary tables, it hasn't been that easy for developers to tell if a variable or reference, such as a source table, is temporary or not, right? And so to improve the code readability, to understand the behavior, and to prevent basically performance problems because you don't have insight or you confuse temporary tables with normal tables, we have now added a new temporary suffix after the table name. So when you hover over this record, you can see that it's a temporary table. And as I said, the benefits are here. And we support these in the IntelliSense and in the tooltips and in the CodeLens. So that makes it a lot easier. Now, just like events, interfaces are also a core part of extending Business Central logic. And until now, it's been hard, again, for developers to quickly find implementations of a given interface, or to go and see all of the different implementations just to see how they are done. And so in this release, we're adding that support, making developers more productive, and removing the need to go look through all references to find it, right? So you're basically just using the standard Visual Studio Code commands. Again, context menu option, go to implementations, or control F12. And this looks a little bit like the references that we saw before, that I invoke this on my interface, and then I can, in the right side, see both the interface definition and all the different places where that interface is implemented. And I can go through that list, and it will highlight a piece of the code on the left side, as highlighted here with the blue box. So I can peek into the various implementation places, or go to that for that matter and see more details. Likewise, the reverse here also on the actual implementations, including the variables. For example, in this case, a code unit variable of type interface. You can see all of the different implementations for that joint specific interface and jump between those and navigate really easily between them. Again, just a time saver from a navigation perspective. In the previous release, we added the ability that you could promote application area from fields to the page object itself. So you didn't have to specify them, or not promote, but you could set it on the page object itself. So you did not have to specify it on the field unless it had to have a different value than what was set on the page. In this release, we're adding 2 new code actions to help with that process. So the first one is that you can basically stand on a field and you can say, I would like to take the application area that's defined on this field and promote it to the page level, right? Set it on the page. And just like with the other code actions that I've shown, you can apply this just for this object, for the file itself, for the project, for the active file, for the active project, or for the whole workspace. And we also have a code action for a related operation, which is that when you both have it defined at the page level, as well as on the fields, you can run a code action to remove all the redundant application areas on fields. So you clean up code and that the fields will only have an application area if it's different from at the page level. And again, you can run that on the specific object, on the file, on the active project, or on the workspace. Then one of the things we heard internally, and probably from most of you also working with local installations, is that when you hit F5 and you want to run something, you actually end up at a different server location than what you thought, right? Maybe you want to run it internally, localhost, but it ends up somewhere else. And the reason for that is that we are relying on a configuration on the NST to decide what to launch. Now you can override that behavior. There's a new parameter in the launch.json configuration that is called use public web URL from server. This is only for on-prem servers. And if you set it to false, we are just going to run as we are today. The server parameter, if you set it to false, that's the new thing. If you set it to false, we're actually going to use the server parameter in the launch.json itself, which is what you see here. I highlighted that with the blue box. Then we're using that. If it's set to true, then we will use the public web URL from the server, right? And that's actually how it's been up until now. And we kept the default for this true to not change the behavior. But you're probably a lot of you that would change that to false to use the settings that you have in your launch.json configuration. Now, when you're working on a new extension, there's often a need to develop against other extensions, which might not be deployed on the Docker or Sandbox environment that you're using. Or maybe you just want to use the new AL Explorer that we saw Esben show before to inspect, some solutions. And so you would really like to point or use some symbols that you haven't downloaded from a server, but you got some from somewhere else. And now the AL.package cache path will support pointing to multiple directories for these symbols, right? So before we only supported one path, now we support multiple paths. And when you are then downloading symbols, once you connect to an instance, then the first entry in this setting will be used for storing new symbols that you download. So maybe a little related again here to today, when you work with controller.ins and you want to specify resources, then you would have to specify individual paths for every single resource, right? A full path for every. So in this scenario, we are setting or including images for the image property, and we have to specify the full path for each of the images. And now you can use a folder path for these resources, right? It works on the images and the scripts and the style sheets properties, and you basically can just use a folder wildcard, right? So if everything as in this example, is under the IMGS folder, you just specify that with a star as a wildcard, and it will pull in the images under that folder. So that again speeds up and makes it a little easier to read this. Now then maybe a minor thing here, but it still improves navigability and understanding of the source. Visual Studio Code has a tool called a type hierarchy. And although AL doesn't really have an inheritance hierarchy, you can now use this. It works on extends and implements. So if you're, for example, here, I'm in the hello world scenario, and I have a page extension that extends a customer list. If I invoke the type hierarchy on customer list, I can see in my scope all of the different page extensions that extend my customer list, and I can navigate and jump to those. And I have another example here of, for example, for the interface, again, I could see the different places that would implement this. So, Steffen, over to you, and maybe you can talk a little bit about, for instance, the improvements we've done to the AL language.
Yes, let's talk about what's new in AL. And let's start off with something really exciting, the for each on text. For each is now supported on text. Might not be that exciting, but let's kick this off with a demo. And to do a demo, I will introduce a friend of mine, the GitHub Copilot, your AI, or maybe in this case, my AL pair programmer. So let's see how that works. Here I have Visual Studio Code, and as you can see down here on the right side, I have activated Copilot. So now we should be able to write some code. I have an action here to count letters in source. Let's try and make a function for that. So local procedure, not quite what I was expecting, but let's do something else. Count the number of letters in source. Yes, that looks fine. Let's do that. We need some variables. This doesn't look like something in a for each statement, so let's write something ourselves here. Maybe a current letter. There we go. That was easy. And let's try and write the content. Begin. And this is a for statement, so maybe just the first part we'll use. Find count is equal, to 0, yes. And then we'll do a for each. And we'll do here we go. Good. Copilot suggests me a nice result here, so let's use that one. And now we're done with this one. Let's just use it somewhere, and we could use it in this action. So we do a trigger on action, there we go. And we do a begin. Oh, it already knows what I want to do, so I'm just going to use that. That's how easy it is to write code with Copilot. It's really simple and nice and easy. So for each on text might not be exciting, but Copilot is. And if you haven't tried it yet, you should go ahead and try it out. Another thing we added is a language selection table. This table will show you all the available languages, including the language tag that you can use for formatting. And you could use that in a report where we've introduced a new method called format region that will allow you to use the language tag and specify the format you want to render dates and numbers and so forth in, allowing you to render localized reports wherever you want and however you want. On medias and media set, we introduced a method called find orphans to allow you to find orphaned media. You can use this yourself and try it out, or you can take a look at the System Code Unit Media Cleanup that actually uses these methods to clean up the media. On records, we introduced read isolation, which allows you to optimize read scenarios. In this case here on the left, I have added a small optimization on count. It's a log de-escalation. Very useful. On record refs, we all know the set table that allows us to set the record to whatever the record ref is pointing to. Now you have the opportunity to add the share table argument, a Boolean, that allows you to share the data that is in a record ref if the record ref is temporary, which is also very nice. For streams, and especially the in-stream, we've added the position property and the reset position method to allow you to easily use the same stream again and again for different purposes. Inherent permissions is now available where you have inherent entitlements, and that allows you to control permissions in code where you cannot rely on the user-assigned permissions. As Peter mentioned, we have now external business events. The new external business event is an attribute that looks like a normal event, but it raises events externally. And this you can use to raise events that can be used in webhooks, or you can use the new Power Automate catalog to find that event and use it there. You can use the required permissions attribute to define who can subscribe to these business events by requiring special permissions before you're allowed to subscribe. On errors, we have a strategy to make errors actionable. And in order to do this, we've added two methods here. We've added an add action method on error info that allows you to invoke a custom method in a code unit. And we've added the add navigation action that allows you to open a page on a specific record. And this would look something like this, giving the user the power to act on the error and actually fix the issues themselves. Talking about errors, let's talk about the debugger. Because we now have debugging of any session. We used to have only the ability to debug your own session, but now we can actually debug other user sessions. So we have the attached to existing session ID, and you use this by specifying the session ID in the launch config, and you can find the session ID in the help and support. You can tighten that even more by also specifying the user ID. There are some rules to how we find the session, and for the first one, we only specify the session ID. We don't care about the actual type of session because you know the session ID, so we expect that that's the session you want to connect to, regardless whether it's a web service client or a web client session. For the other scenario, where you specify both the session ID and the user ID, the user must be the same as you specified, otherwise you're not allowed to connect. Finally, the break on next scenario, you can specify the user ID, and then you can attach to that next session for that user. This gives us parity between snapshot and regular debugging, and enables all the scenarios that we previously only have been able to do with snapshot debugging. One of such scenarios is the service-to-service call that we've only been able to debug using the snapshot debugger up until now. So let me just get this out of the way. So here I have an API page that I want to debug, and I have some code here that I want to debug, so I'm going to add a breakpoint here. I'm going to start a debugging session, if I can. There we go. I'm going to debug without publishing. There we go. And I'm going to use a launch config that is specified or created for service-to-service debugging. And we can go take a look at that one while this one starts up. Here we have it. What it specifies is that I want to break on web service client, and I want to break for this user, the external integration service user, which is a service-to-service user. We can see the debugger has started up, and it's ready to debug the next session of type web service client. And here is Postman. I'm going to use that to connect, and I have set it up to configured with client credentials to service. I'm going to get a new access token, and then I'm going to use that token and fire off a request. And as we see down here, the debugger is breaking. I can do normal debugging. I can inspect the variables, and I can see that this user is actually not the same user as I'm debugging with. So I am debugging a different session than my own, in this case, the service-to-service session. In order to get all of this working, we needed to change the service. And let's talk a little bit about what we did to make this work. So in a normal debugging scenario, the classic one we know, I would fire up a debugging session from VS Code. And once that's connected to some kind of node in the cluster, I would start the scenario from my client, and it would hopefully get to the same node. Because it happens within a very few seconds or within a minute, the balancer will say, well, I know you, and I'll send you to the same node. So that's why it normally works online. When we talk about attaching, we're kind of turning the scenario upside down because the user has already started some kind of session. Or we'll talk about the next, debug next a little bit later. But in this case, the user has started some kind of session. So when we come with the VS Code and say we want to debug, we might end up on some other node somewhere because we're not the same user, maybe not the same time. So we need to change this. What we did instead is we told the balancer, hey, I want to debug a session with this ID and or maybe also the username. And then the balancer would go and say, okay, who's got this session? And once that session is known and where it is, we will send the debugging request to that node so debugging can occur as normally. With the debug next, it's kind of the opposite way around. So we start a debugging session up front. Since we can't change the client to say, hey, I want to be debugged, we need to tell the balancer, I am ready to debug this kind of session. And the balancer says, hey, you got 10 minutes to get that started. And then we have 10 minutes to get that request in. And once that request gets in, it gets load balanced to the right node where the debugging context is in place already. And we're ready to debug. Talking about online changes, back to you, Peter.
Thank you, Stefan. It's really, really great to have attach there and also the load balancing fixed. We remember that from the snapshot debugging, and this really improves the hit rate here. And we can only encourage all of you to start using the attach feature as well, both in the debugger and in the snapshot debugger. It is really a good productivity feature. So let's talk about briefly AppSource transactability, because there's another major thing for this release. The big question here is really, would you like to sell through Microsoft when you have apps in AppSource? Because AppSource transactability has now finally arrived for Business Central apps. So that means that your customers can see pricing on AppSource. You can show different plans, that's basically SKUs on AppSource, and the customer can see that price in the detail. You can also have hidden private plans for a select set of customers that only, when the customer logs into AppSource, only for the customers that you selected would be able to see these private plans. And then the customers can purchase, right? They can select a buy now within AppSource itself. So what they can do here is that there's a checkout process. They can use their credit card, they can purchase the app, they can install the app, and they can manage and license users in their Microsoft Admin Center. So are you as excited as we are about this? Do you want to learn more? Do you want to know about the supported scenarios, the demo flow for the partners and the customers, the technical details, how you can try this out yourself, whether or not you have an app already in AppSource, or you've been waiting for this before you put your app in AppSource? And then would you like to understand a little bit about the roadmap going forward? Then we have a full session on this. Myself and Kurt have a session about Transact capabilities for Business Central apps. So I really encourage you to go and join that session. But since we are talking about AppSource, let's talk about some of the improvements we've done to the existing AppPros processes. So the first one is how we support hotfixing your apps. Now, in this first scenario, let's imagine that you have submitted a version for Business Central, version 21. So this is your app here that's compatible there. And then you submit a new version which is compatible both with this existing Business Central as well as the next major Business Central, the one that we are launching now and is upcoming. So you basically have your app here, and that app is compatible with both the old version and the new version. That's great, right? If you then want to fix something, you want to provide a new version of your app, that's just straightforward. You submit a new version. The example here is that you had a version 1.0, you submitted a new 2.0, and then you had to fix that, and you submitted a version 2.1. This is great because the app is compatible both with the current version in market as well as with the next version that we are launching. Now, let's look at how it's been if a partner have chosen to uptake features in the upcoming version, right? Maybe there's some breaking changes from the base app, or maybe there's new functionality that you would like to uptake, so that the app is no longer compatible with the next version, right? So let's see how that flows. First, you submit again a version for Business Central 21, but you cannot now submit a version compatible with both the old version and the new version. So you submit an app which is only compatible with the new version, right? You uptake these new features. you incorporate some of these breaking changes. And now suddenly you need to submit a hotfix for your existing customers on BC21, right? On your version 1.0 app here. And you would really like to submit let's say a version 1.5 sitting in between here, but that one is only compatible with version 21 and not version 22. And when you submit this, we are actually, until now, checking that this app is compatible both with version 21 and version 22. And since it's not compatible with version 2, you're not able to hotfix this, right? So you're kind of caught in this. And so until now, the partner behavior has been that typically they would delay submitting an app which is compatible with the next major to keep their app in custom installations compatible with all Business Central releases so that they can hotfix, right? And also delay uptaking new functionalities or new AI language features for the same reason. And so the impact of this is that the AppSource apps are either not ready for the next major until a delay. We also see lower uptake of new application features or lower uptake of new AI language features, right? Typically then coming in a minor in the Business Central version. And so because we would really like to have the apps ready sooner, we are addressing this in this release. So let's look at the scenario again. You submitted a version which is compatible with version 21. This is your version 1.0. Again, you cannot submit a version which is compatible with both 21 and 22 because you uptake new features in 22, so you have a hard dependency on version 22. Scenario from before. And now you have to hotfix again, right? Version 1.0 with your 1.5. But what happens now? When you now submit this, we will actually look at this and compute the max version that your hotfix app supports. And we will then use that in our validation and say that, okay, we validate now this new hotfix app, but we are excluding validating it against the next major here, the version 22, because we know it's not compatible with that, right? So you will be able to hotfix now the prior versions. That means that you will now be able to uptake these capabilities or breaking changes, etc., while still retaining supportability of your existing customers. Now, there is one thing that you need to keep in mind, which should be obvious, and that is that now that you can do this, we of course still need to ensure that the customers can upgrade from the hotfixed version. So when you submit this, we will not validate it against the next version, but we will do breaking change validation for the hotfix, both verify that you can go from 1.0 to 1.5, the hotfix version, but we will also now validate that customers can go, once they're hotfixed, can go from 1.5 to 2.0, bearing in mind that 2.0 was actually released before 1.5, right? It needs to be an upgrade path for customers. So that means, if we summarize it, that you can now hotfix your apps even when you have released a newer app which is only compatible with the next release of this, etc. But you need to make sure that the upgrade path works. So you can change the business logic, you can introduce new local procedures or internal objects, but you cannot make new public objects or tables or something like that, which is not in the newer version, because then in the newer version, we will see that as that you have removed something and you're not allowed to do those kind of breaking changes. But the benefits of this should be that the partner should be able to get ready for the next major earlier and uptake new features, but also that customers can be upgraded and benefit from new functionality sooner. Then the other thing that we are looking into for AppSource apps is to have a preview capability. This is actually something that AppSource supports already today. When you submit an app to AppSource, it initially actually is in preview mode until you say that you want to go live. But Business Central does not support that preview mode. And what the preview mode allows is that you can you basically get a link, and you can share that link with a select set of customers to test out your app before you go live with it. And our proposed scope for this, but as I said, we haven't begun on this yet. We expect this to come in a minor update for 2023 Release Wave 1. But it is, of course, to adopt the normal way of doing this in AppSource, so that you upload the app, the new version, it goes into preview mode. And the way AppSource works is then that either you manually specify or you have Partner Center generate a so-called flight code. And that flight code needs then to be in the URL for the app. And anyone having that URL with the flight code can then install the app. They will not see it through the AppSource marketplace, but if they have the URL, they can do a direct install. That you can then share with your customers. We have not decided yet whether we want to support this on sandboxes, production environment, or both, as well as to what degree we want, how finished we want the preview apps to be, right? Whether you are allowed to try something out in the preview app and then make a breaking change between preview apps. That also depends a little bit about whether we support it in production environments or not, because if we support it in production environments, there of course needs to be an upgrade path. But I have to say, likely in the first version, we will not support these breaking changes, but it's still a little bit TBD. And sometime in the minor update, likely 22.3 or 4. So that brings us to the last topic of today, which is just a little bit of information. The first one is that we are now giving you telemetry signals for the validation we are doing when you are uploading PTEs, right? So we have a bunch here, 11 signals for basically when the PTE submission is started, whether something goes wrong with the submission, the validation we're performing on the main PTE, as well as the downstream or dependent PTEs. We're giving insights. If that fails, we're bringing that insight to you in telemetry, right? And they are sent to two app insights, the app insights for the tenant, as well as for the PTE as specified in the app.json. And we do expect these to be in the Power BI telemetry app for resellers within the near future. Then another thing we just want to highlight is that we used to have a setting in the V6 that you could use the legacy, the runtime, and we are no longer supporting that. So any use of this will just be ignored. I mean, you can still keep the setting, but we're not going to respect it anymore. And then I want to highlight that per tenant extensions have now moved to the tenant database itself. That means that it's together with any other customer data. It allows backups of PTEs together with the tenant. It also means that we are in compliance with Schrems 2, which basically means that we need to have in-region storage of all the customer artifacts, including per tenant extensions. And it also unlocks future support for having dev extensions persisted across sandbox updates or upgrades, something we're not doing today. I don't have a timeline for that, but this lays the ground for being able to do that, right? But one implication of this is that PTEs now count towards the database size. Should not be a big thing for the majority of you, but if you deploy tons of PTEs and they're very large, you should just observe this. And you can, of course, clean up that size by unpublishing the PTEs. I think that brings us to the end here. Oops, that was one too many. We have a number of other launch event sessions that are related a little bit to development. As I said, we have the Transact capabilities for Business Central apps. There's also the What's New in Server and What's New in Telemetry that will talk to some of the AL language improvements that Stefan talked to, and also some of the telemetry that I talked to. And then, of course, What's New in AL Go for GitHub is a central piece of a good development infrastructure that you should really use CI/CD. We have a number of resources for you. Usually, Yammer. You can join us on Twitter. If you're looking for resources, 4 months ago or so, we released this aka.ms/bcall, which is a landing page that points you to all the other aliases. That's a very good starting point. If you have feedback, BC ideas as usual, and just join the office hours that we'll have on different topics to give us feedback. Thank you for your time.